Richard.
Good to see you too, Jim. Jim, I love the fact that the very first thing you heard from Australia this morning was where the toilets are.
Or as you would say, where the hell are the toilets?
Where the hell are the toilets? That's exactly right. And unlike all my other books, I would actually be able to answer that particular question. Jim, as you know, what we're going to do is I'm going to introduce you now very briefly, and then you're going to speak to your book for about, for as long as you like, but 20 to 30 minutes. We're expecting that. And then you and I will have a conversation for about 15. We're going to have a couple of stand-up breaks as well for the crowd here, and maybe for you too. And then we'll take questions from the floor. And we thought maybe the best way to do that, so that you see the questioner, is that, and I'm saying this mainly for the room here, if you have a question for Father Jim, then I'd invite you to come up here. We'll turn it back around this way, so that you can come up here and he can see you, and then we can all see his reply from there. I'm going to say, does that sound okay with you, Jim? We're doing that whether you like it or not, so sorry about that.
That's fine with me.
Let me introduce you to James Martin. James Martin graduated from the University of Pennsylvania's prestigious Wharton School of Business in 1982 and worked in corporate finance at General Electric for 6 years. He entered the Jesuits in 1988 and was ordained in 1999. Jim was commissioned by his provincial superior of the New England province to work at the US Jesuit flagship publication in New York City called America, and is presently its editor-at-large. He's written or edited more than 11 books and is a much sought-after religious commentator for all the major US networks and newspapers. Stephen Colbert affectionately calls him the Colbert Report's chaplain, and I affectionately call him my brother and my friend. Jim, welcome to Sydney from New York City via Skype. Congratulations. Congratulations on your new book, Jesus, a Pilgrimage, and we very much look forward to your reflections and then the conversation that will ensue from here on in. We're going to turn you around, or turn this podium around, so that you're able to see the very people you're about to talk to, okay? So we'll do that bit of housekeeping, and then we'll look forward to hearing from you.
Yeah, okay. How's that? Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Good. Well, I'll pretend that I'm trying to reach you all the way from New York. I'm very happy to be here with you. I want to, thank you for inviting me. Thank you for not asking me to make the, whatever it is, 20-hour plane ride to come see you. I'm also very happy to be with my very good friend, Richard Leonard, who is a dear friend, and I can't say enough good things about him. And and also please buy his books, which are terrific. I want to talk to you tonight about Jesus, as you probably know. By the way, if the sound gets crazy, just raise your hands, and I can call back, or if you want me to speak up, just let me know. So I want to talk about a story that spans several decades, and it shows why it sometimes takes a long time for people, including myself, to really get the Gospels and to begin to understand Jesus. The first chapter happened when I was a Jesuit novice, way back in 1988. A long time ago, during the first month of my novitiate, I read a book that talked about a place called the Bay of Parables. Okay, the Bay of Parables. And, well, I can't remember what book it was. I remember it was somewhere in our novitiate library. I remember the really strong impression that it made on me. In the Gospel of Luke, Jesus finds himself so hemmed in, so pressed in by crowds, that he climbs aboard a boat and asks Peter to row out into the Sea of Galilee so that he can preach from the shore. And the Gospels of Mark and Matthew also record similar incidents of Jesus' preaching from a boat. In Galilee, said this book, there is still a place called the Bay of Parables at the Sea of Galilee, where that gospel passage most likely happened. Near the shoreline, they say, is like a naturally occurring amphitheater, right? Where people would have been able to sit comfortably, think of it like an amphitheater, half of a stadium, where people would have been able to sit comfortably and listen to Jesus. Moreover, the unique acoustics of the site would have made it easier for people to hear him. The idea that people could identify exactly where a particular scripture story happened, right here, really struck me. I remember thinking, to use some theological language, that's really cool. I just love that idea. But the explanation baffled me. Why would Jesus get into a boat to preach? Why wouldn't he just stand at the shore? I mean, you all live by the sea, and you can kind of understand that. Why wouldn't he just stand on the beach and preach? Because of its oddness, the story of the Bay of Parables really stuck with me. So chapter 2 in this little story, about 10 years later, I'm on a summer vacation at a Jesuit house outside of Boston, Massachusetts. And we're at a summer vacation house that's overlooking a harbor. And the harbor's about a mile away from us. We're kind of on a hill. Harbor's down there. And there's a little sailing school that we can hear from the harbor. You know those little, I don't know if they call them the same thing in Australia, the sunfish boats, the little sailboats, basically. And there were all these kids in a little sailing school. To my amazement, we could hear the kids as if they were 10 feet away. I mean, you could hear them saying, "Oh, my rudder doesn't work, and I don't know what to do, and my sail is busted." So we see these little dots down in the harbor, and we can hear them perfectly well. So I remarked to a fellow Jesuit how odd it was that we could hear the kids. And he said, "Well, of course," he says, "sound travels very easily over water. Didn't you know that?" He said, "You remember that story about Jesus preaching from the boat?" He said, "That's one reason he did it. The people were able to hear him better." His casual insight really delighted me. It reminded me once again that what we might not get in the Gospels often turns out to have a real-life explanation once we think about the historical context of the story. So chapter 3. 3 years ago, I took a pilgrimage to the Holy Land as part of research for this book that I've just written, this Jesus a Pilgrimage, which, by the way, makes the perfect gift for your friends and family at Christmas time. And I was there for about 2 weeks with a good friend of mine named George, who's a Jesuit. He's also a prison chaplain. So George and I arrived about 10 years after our encounter with the sailing school in Boston. And the first day of our time at the Jesuit community in Jerusalem, the superior of the Jesuit community, a Vietnamese Jesuit named Father Duan, asks us what we would most like to see. And I say, having waited 25 years, I say, the Bay of Parables. And Father Duan says, "The what?" And I thought, well, okay, maybe it's the one place he hasn't heard of. Now, mind you, he's a scripture scholar who lives in the Holy Land. I thought, well, all right, maybe he hasn't heard of that one place. So already I was getting a little worried. Anyway, a few days later, my friend and I make the 4-hour drive from Jerusalem to the Sea of Galilee. And we settle ourselves into the Franciscan guest house, which is right on the Mount of the Beatitudes, right there. And the sister in charge, who is, by the way, a scripture scholar, there are tons of scripture scholars in the Holy Land, comes up to us and says, "So, fathers, what would you most like to see?" And I say, "The Bay of Parables." And she says, "The what?" And I described it to her, the naturally occurring amphitheater, Sea of Galilee, the acoustics. Now, mind you, she lives on the Sea of Galilee, and she's a New Testament scholar. And she said, "I've never heard of it." So afterwards, my friend George said to me, it's like you were talking to her about Santa's workshop in the North Pole. Anyway, a few hours later, we make our way to a place called Tabgha, which is the site for the multiplication of the loaves and the fishes. And we pray in a small Benedictine chapel there. And it's run by some German Benedictine monks. So afterwards, I said to my friend George, I said, "I'm going to ask him a question." And George said, "If you ask him about the Bay of Parables, I'm leaving." So, we embarrass our friends sometimes. So I go over to the guy, and I know like 5 words of German, and I say, "Bitte, Wo ist the Bay of Parables? And I fully expect him to say the what? And instead, in this thick German accent, he says, oh, yeah, the Bay of Parables. I know where the Bay of Parables is. So I call George over, and he starts translating, and the guy says something. And then George says, we should walk through this little opening in the bushes. And then the guy says something else. And George looks at him. And he looks at me, and he looks at him again, and he says, excuse me? The guy repeats it again. And George says, I think he said that there are violet-colored rocks that we should look for. And the German guy goes, yeah, violet-colored rocks. There are violet-colored rocks you will find. So we thought, all right, so we set out, must have been 110 degrees, and we go through the bush. Now there's no one there. And sure enough, we almost trip over these huge boulders spray painted with violet colors. And George says, oh, violet colored rocks. So we go a little further, and immediately the ground drops from beneath us, and guess what? We are on the rim of a naturally occurring amphitheater. We're standing on the rim of this beautiful amphitheater in the ground that faces the Sea of Galilee. People had likely stood here and listened to Jesus preach. Or as they say in the Holy Land, if not here, then 10 feet from here. It was easy to imagine Jesus preaching from the boat. But you know what? I saw something then that amazed me even more. All around us was this: rocks, rocky ground, fertile ground, and thorns. Does that sound familiar? Yes. In the parable of the sower, as you know, Jesus tells the story of a farmer who goes out to sow and whose seed falls on different kinds of ground, right? It illustrates the way that the word is received. It's told in all the synoptic gospels. And he uses the rocks as people where they hear the word but don't allow it to take root. The thorny ground is an image for those who hear the word, but the lure of wealth and the cares of the world choke it off. And the fertile ground is the one who hears the word and it reproduces 30, 60, 100-fold. As I stood under the broiling sun with my friend, I was amazed to see rocks and thorns and fertile ground. It wasn't as if anyone had carted in the topsoil or brought in thorn bushes or arranged the rocks to make it look like it was in Jesus' time, like we were in a theme park, called Jesus Land, right? I mean, they were just there, right? And it dawned on me that when Jesus used nature images, simple images, to convey his message, seeds, birds, wheat, clouds, rocks, thorns, he wasn't talking in generalities, but about these things right here, right? Not those people are like rocks in general, or those people are like thorn bushes, but those people are like that thorn bush right there. Or those people are like those rocks right there, turn around. It really kind of grounded the Gospels, you know what I mean? It grounded the Gospels in a way that I could have never imagined. And it reminded me that once again, that Jesus Christ, the one that we worship, the fully divine Son of God, is also fully human. He's fully human and fully divine. Let's unpack that for a bit. To begin with, Jesus of Nazareth, the person who walked the landscape of first century Palestine, wasn't God pretending to be human. He was a real-life, flesh and blood human being. He was born, he lived and died. As a child, he needed to be fed, held, nursed, burped, and changed. Right? He had a body like yours and mine, which meant that he ate, drank, and slept. He experienced sexual longings and urges. The adult Jesus felt joy. Right? We know that he was a joyful person. At one point in the Gospels, he's critiqued for being a glutton and a drunkard. He says that of himself. He's basically being critiqued for living it up. Right? We know that he weeps. He weeps at Lazarus' tomb. He grew weary at the end of a long day. Right? He had headaches. He had stomach aches. He maybe threw up a couple of times. Right? He had a body like yours and mine. Everything proper to the human being except sin, Jesus experienced. Now, Jesus' humanity is a stumbling block for a lot of people, especially those who prefer to focus just on his divinity, right? Stories that show him displaying intense emotions, or acting humanly, right, really discomforts us, right? So, for example, the story in the Gospel of Mark, where Jesus meets a woman who wants healing for her daughter. She's not Jewish, and as a result, Jesus seems to dismiss her with a comment, "It is not right to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs." I mean, that's a stinging remark, no matter what the context, right? When the woman explains that even dogs get crumbs from the table, Jesus softens and heals her daughter. But why did he speak to her like that? You know, was he testing her faith, as a lot of people say? If so, it's a very harsh way of doing so. You know, calling someone a dog, either her people, her and her daughter, or just her, right? Maybe he wasn't expecting to perform miracles in this non-Jewish area where he was, right? But still, it's a very harsh way of addressing her. Perhaps Jesus needed to learn something from her persistence, that his ministry extended to everyone, not just Jews. Or maybe he was just tired, right? Earlier in the gospel, Mark says he entered a house and did not want anyone to know he was there. So maybe that remark indicates a little weariness, right? Whatever the reason, either he's tired or he's weary, it shows his humanity on full display. But that's only part of the story, because the next part of the story is a healing, right? Jesus says to the woman, "For saying that you may go, the demon has left your daughter." And she returns home and to find the daughter lying on the bed, healed. Fully human and fully divine means that Jesus wasn't just a great guy, a charismatic prophet, or a courageous healer. He was God, right? He was God. I mean, and that's very difficult for people to accept too. I'm sure you all know people for whom his divinity is a stumbling block, right? But signs of his divinity are everywhere in the Gospels. He performed astonishing deeds, as you know, works of power or signs, healing the sick, calming storms, raising people from the dead. Even his detractors take note of his miracles, right? As when they critique him for healing on the Sabbath, or, you know, where does your power come from? For a lot of people, though, his divinity is a kind of embarrassment. Talk of the supernatural can be disturbing. Despite the proportion of the Gospels that focus on those works of power and other signs of his divinity, many people want to confine his identity to that of a wise teacher, right? Thomas Jefferson, the second president of the United States, went as far as to create his own gospel by literally scissoring out the parts of the Gospels he didn't like, right? He actually cut and paste, he took out the miracles and the resurrection, right? He wanted a Jesus he could tame, a Jesus that didn't threaten him, right? But you can't tame Jesus. Interestingly, one scripture scholar read Thomas Jefferson's gospel to get a sense of who Jesus was for Thomas Jefferson, and he found that Thomas Jefferson's gospel was this, Thomas Jefferson's Jesus was kind of a wise sage, you know, real intellectual. So basically, Thomas Jefferson's Jesus was Thomas Jefferson. But humanity and divinity are both part of Jesus' story. Omit one or the other, and it's not Jesus we're talking about, it's our own creation. Now, much of this division between people who want just a human Jesus and people who want just a divine Jesus can be seen in two types of approaches today. People who prefer the Jesus of history and people who prefer the Christ of faith. Now, in Jesus of history or historical Jesus studies, scholars try to look at as much as we can know about the life and times of Jesus of Nazareth. So they focus on topics like Jewish customs in first century Palestine, what it was like living under Roman rule, and the ways a carpenter would sustain his family. So that's really important to know to get a sense of who Jesus was, right? That's historical Jesus studies. The idea is starting with Jesus as the human being. It's often called a Christology from below, study of Christ from below, Jesus the human being. But there's just as many scholars and theologians who focus on his place in the Christian faith, right? These people consider topics like how does Christ save us, right, by his death and resurrection? What is his nature, the relationship to the Father and to the Holy Spirit? This is a focus on the Christ of faith, and it's a Christology from above, starting from Jesus as divine. So the difference between these two kinds of approaches can be shown with a brief example, the story of the raising of Lazarus. Raise your hands if you know the story of Lazarus. Good. I figured as much. So as you know the story of Lazarus. And there are lots of parts of that story that show his humanity, I think. he cries at the tomb of Lazarus, right? Even something like the line where it says, Jesus loved Mary and Martha and her brother Lazarus, right? And then the line where Jesus finds out that Lazarus is sick from the sisters, they send him a message, and interestingly, it doesn't say Lazarus of Bethany is ill, or Lazarus, our brother, is ill, or your friend Lazarus is ill. You remember what it says? It says, he whom you love is ill. It's a real insight into the kind of human relationships he has with Lazarus. And of course, he goes there, he weeps, he asks for the stone to be rolled away, and he calls out in a British voice, British inflected voice, because he went to Cambridge, that's what we know from the movies. And Richard can talk to you about those Jesus movies. He says, Lazarus, come forth. And the stone is rolled away and he comes out. Now, here's the point. A historical Jesus scholar might ask questions like, what were Jewish burial practices at the time? Is there a religious significance to remember he waits a couple of days? What is the role of women in Jewish burial practices at that time? Is it odd that Mary and Martha would have come out to greet him? So answers to those questions help us understand what happened in Bethany on that day. It helps us understand what Jesus did in a real place and a real time. Someone starting from the vantage point of a Christ the faith, however, would ask different questions. They would say, what does the raising of Lazarus tell us about Jesus' divine power? How does the idea of Jesus' life show itself in the story? Right? And in a spirituality book, I'm sure you would have read something like this, the question would be, what does the raising of Lazarus tell you about your own life? Where is Jesus calling to you and calling you out of your tombs, right? Both sets of questions are important. That's my point, my brothers and sisters. And if we lose sight of either perspective, we risk turning Jesus either into God pretending to be human or a human pretending to be God. The two approaches are complementary, not contradictory. So books that just look at one approach or another are incomplete, and you will see many books like this in your studies. I'm sure you've all read historical Jesus books. They're very, very important. We have to know the life and times of Jesus. What was his life like? What did it mean when he said certain things? Why would he have reacted in certain ways? We look at archaeology to understand the life and times. We look at other writings, so it's very important. The problem is when they get to questions of his divinity, signs of his power like in the miracles or the resurrection, they always set them aside. And that's not the whole story. But there are just as many books, I'm sure spirituality books, who don't tackle the historical stuff at all. They say, we don't want to talk about mere historical considerations, which is crazy. How can you understand Jesus outside the context of his times? To fully meet Jesus, the believer needs to both understand the Jesus of history, the one who walked the earth, and to encounter the Christ of faith, the one who rose from the dead. Both approaches seek to understand that question that the disciples grappled with when Jesus asked them on the way to Caesarea Philippi, who do people say that I am, right? Moreover, Jesus is always fully human and fully divine. He's not fully divine in one spot and fully human in another. I always like to tell people, he is divine when he is sawing a plank of wood in the carpentry workshop in Nazareth, and he's human when he's raising Lazarus from the dead, right? Now, there's some things that remain a mystery, of course, about that fully human, fully divine person that we can't know. For example, what's going on in his mind? How is he relating to the Father, basically, right? I had a scripture professor, Richard Leonard knows him, maybe you've heard of him, Father Daniel Harrington, who taught at Boston College, and we had a New Testament course, and someone got up once. I'm sure this doesn't happen in Australia, but in the United States, sometimes people get up and ask questions not to ask a question, but to show how much they know. I'm sure that never happens there, right? So this guy got up and he stood up, and we never stand up to ask questions in class. He said, Father Harrington, with what we know about Jesus as the second person in the Trinity, and his relationship vis-a-vis the Father and the Holy Spirit, and his self-understanding, as he is performing this miracle, what is going through his mind? And Father Harrington said, we have no idea. But there's some things we can know, right? Based on the Gospels, but also through, as I said, the research into the historical Jesus. So very briefly, think about Nazareth, right? Nazareth was a tiny little town. And how many people are in that room right now, would you say? 50, 100?
Yeah, 100.
100, okay. So Nazareth, believe it or not, was about 2 or 3 times as big as the people in this room. Nazareth was 200 to 400 people. It's tiny. It's a little backwater town, right? It was very poor. It explains why it's almost a joke in the New Testament. When the apostle Nathaniel hears where Jesus is from, he says, "Can anything good come from Nazareth?" Right? People said that was probably a saying around the time. Jesus came from a very poor town. It's not mentioned anywhere in the Talmud or the Old Testament. Dozens and dozens of other towns in Galilee are mentioned. Nazareth is not mentioned at all, right? So Jesus comes from this town. What did he do? Well, he was a carpenter. The Greek word is tekton. Tekton was probably more like, a construction worker, right? Even a day laborer, some scholars say, right? It would have been difficult work. He works for 18 years. He works from the ages of 12 to 30. That's a long time. A lot of us tend to think of Jesus just kind of sitting on his butt, and, he's found in the temple, and then he says, "I'll just wait around for 18 years until my baptism," But he works. He works hard, right? And interestingly, the work of the carpenter was seen as below that of the peasant, because the carpenter didn't have the benefit of a plot of land, okay? We can see traces of that in the gospel. In the Gospel of Mark, when Jesus stands up and proclaims his mission, they say, "Is this not the carpenter?" Right? Who is this guy? He's just a carpenter. Later on, in the Gospel of Matthew, do you know what he said? They say, "Is this not the son of the carpenter?" You see what just happened? We've moved Jesus away from that kind of low class to them occupation. And then in Luke and John, it's, "Is this not the son of Joseph?" No carpenter. So by looking at the Gospels and by looking at kind of historical research, we can get a sense of what Jesus' life was like, right? Another quick thing. An hour and a half's walk away was a town called Sepphoris, Sepphoris. It was a booming town of 30,000 people, an hour and a half away, being rebuilt by King Herod. Okay, it was very lavish. It had an amphitheater with 3,000 people. It had a fortress, royal courts, banks, and beautiful homes with frescoes and mosaics. Now, think about it for a minute. Here's a carpenter in a poor town an hour and a half away looking for work. Do you not think he would walk an hour and a half? I mean, you know how it is in rural places, right? Maybe some of you grew up in rural places and walking an hour and a half wasn't a problem, right? It's very likely Jesus would have gone to Sepphoris looking for work, at least once or twice. What would he have seen there? He would have seen houses with mosaics and frescoes. He would have seen great income disparities. What would that have done to him when he comes back to Nazareth and sees his mother at her back-breaking labor in a poor town, right? We tend to think of Jesus's sayings and insights and parables about income disparities as divinely inspired, which they are. He's fully divine. But they also come from human experience, right? He sees things. He has experiences, right? So what I'm trying to do is to remind us always to combine that fully human and fully divine person. It helps us to understand him. It helps us when we pray to Jesus, to remember that he's fully human and fully divine. Now, there's a lot of questions that remain unanswerable. Some are answerable about the fully human, fully divine person. But in the end, it's a mystery. But it's a beautiful mystery, really the most beautiful one I know, and one well worth pondering. Thank you very much. Thank you. And now I think Father Richard's going to ask me a few tough questions.
You better believe it.
We're very good friends. We are very good friends, so this is actually kind of funny.
We won't be good friends by the end of this session. That's not true. Jim, thanks very much for that terrific presentation about some of the big themes of this book, or one of the big theme of the book. It struck me though when I read the book and then been thinking about today, how many of your books are actually about pilgrimages of sorts. The pilgrimage to Africa, from corporate America, to Ground Zero after 9/11, to Lourdes, and now to the Holy Land. I'm sure you're aware of it too, but there's an ongoing theme of pilgrimage in your life, both physical pilgrimage and also spiritual pilgrimage. And of course, It wouldn't be a Jesuit talking to a Jesuit if we don't mention St. Ignatius right up front. They say a Jesuit cannot get through a talk without mentioning our holy founder. And with the present Pope, he's never had it so good as he's got it right now, St. Ignatius. And I thought one of the extraordinary things, of course, Ignatius always calls himself the Pilgrim, and one of the places he most wanted to go to in his life, and indeed did go to, was the Holy Land. And it struck me that one of the lovely things in this book, there are two Ignatian things in this book that I think you do beautifully. The first is the composition of place, which was very important for Ignatian prayer, for those of us in that tradition, and also Ignatian contemplation. And I wondered whether you just might say a few things about how that informed your own writing and how you develop it in the book.
Yeah, sure. So for people who aren't familiar with that way of praying, Ignatius invites us to imagine ourselves in a particular scripture scene, and you try to use your imagination to, place yourself there, and you trust that the kinds of things that happen while you're in the scene imaginatively are ways that God has of revealing something to you about the scripture passage, something to you about yourself, and maybe something to you about God. So it's a way of using your imagination in prayer. It's funny, there are two ways that impacted the book. The first way is an easy way to see, which is I tell people, what the fruits of my prayer have been around these particular scripture passages. So, for example, if we go to Bethany, to see where Lazarus was raised, I talk about something that happened in my own prayer, as a way of kind of making it real for the reader, and to say, so what? What does this mean to us today? So just kind of share some of those spiritual insights. But interestingly, that way of prayer sort of dissuaded me at the beginning, and I think Richard knows this story, from going at all. I wasn't going to go to the Holy Land, and the editor of America Magazine, a guy named Drew Christensen, who had vast knowledge of Israel, said, well, you really should go if you're writing a book about Jesus. And I said, oh no, I've imagined those places. I don't need to go. I have my own Sea of Galilee. Why would I want some touristy locale to kind of, overshadow it. But he really pushed me and said, you really have to go. So I went, and it was amazing. I mean, it's one thing to imagine the Sea of Galilee. It's another thing to be there. And particularly in Galilee, for those of you who've been there, you know that it's quite untouched, the sea. And so
it's very beautiful. It is.
Basically see what Jesus saw.
It's very beautiful, isn't it? It's really, it's magnificent.
It's stunning. So in a way, I think Ignatian contemplation helped the book. I hope it almost hurt the book by kind of convincing me that I didn't need to go.
One of the things Ignatius wanted to do, in sort of his naivety in a way, is he wanted to see which way Jesus' feet were on the rock of the Ascension. Now, you get to the Rock of the Ascension, but you don't tell us which way the feet are. I was very, very disappointed about that.
I know that's a very important question for you in your own personal spirituality, Richard.
Neither of us are strictly professional theologians or biblical scholars, but through the sort of books we write about theology and culture, I guess, and trying to take theology into the marketplace to speak to a very broad audience, not just scholars, academics, or students of theology. We're trying to say something to the layperson. Can you just talk to me about what audience you had in mind? Often when we come to write books, we've got people or groups or even an individual sometimes that we're actually writing for. When you came to write up this book, who did you have in mind? Who's the audience?
Yeah, that's a great question. I always have in mind me at age 25.
Right. You might need, if people haven't read My Life with the Saints, you might need to just give us give us a profile of Jim Martin at 25.
Jim Martin at 25 had not gone to a Catholic elementary school, not gone to a Catholic high school, certainly did not go to a Catholic college by any stretch of the imagination. My religious education stopped at about confirmation, which in my day would have been at about 12 or 13. So I knew nothing about the scriptures. I would go to Mass and I'd hear these stories, but that's it. And so, I think that's where, I can speak for my country, I think that's where a lot of American Catholics are. They're not particularly literate biblically, theologically, or religiously, I think, or spiritually, in terms of prayer or anything. So I assume that the person knows nothing. And I think that's actually a good way to start writing, basically. I think too many spirituality books, even scripture books, assume that, you know what exegesis is, or how the Gospels were put together.
I once heard a preacher on Sunday get up and talk about in the same homily. You mentioned the word exegesis, eisegesis, and hermeneutics, and the woman next to me said, "Herman who?"
No, it's crazy. I always say, and Rich, I know you agree with this. There's no reason for things to be so complex.
That's right.
Jesus used birds, seeds, wheat. He didn't talk about hermeneutics, or the whatever. Yeah, so I wrote basically for, I would say, an educated audience. I mean, people who are literate, but who may not know everything about the New Testament. Nonetheless, I assume that people can come up to speed very quickly. So
Yep.
it's not a primer. It's not sort of elementary. And for those people who know it, they can sort of zip through some of the stuff on how the Gospels were constructed and get right into the heart of things.
I don't know if you got the sense, but even when you said about Nazareth being 200 to 400 people, there was a little buzz in the room. That changes the way that we all look at those things. So they're good for all of us, I think, to re-enter into the passages for prayer, for preachers, for teachers, for people who are just trying to read the Gospels for their own spiritual development. They're really helpful things to know. And that's one of the lovely things in this. You hold together so much extraordinary scholarship, but you do it through what's called, as you know, narrative theology. It's through this pilgrimage. So you're constant. I've just felt sorry for you and George. It was obviously searing heat. You were there.
Terrible.
Well, you should come to Australia. We know about hot days too, so you'll get no sympathy. You keep whining about. You can't say whinge, by the way. If I'm talking to American, I've got to say a whine. He whines about the heat all the way through the damn book. I think, come to Australia for God's sake.
Well, it's funny. At one point, we were in literally the valley of the shadow of death. We found out that's where.
And
we
I
were.
hope you said Psalm 23.
Yeah, it was 120 degrees, and I thought my friend was literally going to have a heart attack, and I thought I was going to faint. I've never been so hot. I worked in Africa for 2 years. I was never so hot, and I said to George, "Do you think we'll go to heaven if we die during a pilgrimage to the Holy Land?" And between breaths, he said, "We better."
Much more seriously, you spent a bit of time covering the miracles. Now, as you know, and you've already intimated, miracles really do divide both biblical scholars and also theologians, because at one level they can be metaphorical or allegorical. You tend to go fairly traditionally about miracles. So why do you think it is hard for people to accept Jesus' miracles?
Yeah, well, as I said, it's very hard for some people to accept talk of the supernatural, to accept something that can strike people as almost magical. But I always go back to the idea that nothing is impossible with God. I mean, we believe that. That, as I like to tell people, if God could create the world ex nihilo, from nothing, then having someone still a storm is kind of small potatoes. And I really think it is an invitation for us to say that God can do anything. And it was funny. I was directing a young man last night who was struggling with the miraculous, and he has had this particular person I'm directing, spiritual direction, has had, without breaking confidences, miraculous things happen in his life in terms of healing and growth and things that he never would have thought possible through his relationship with Jesus during the spiritual exercises. And I said, look, those things have really happened to you, haven't they? And he said, absolutely. And I said, and this is just you praying, with me as your spiritual director. Imagine, on a scale of magnitude, what happens in the presence of Jesus Christ himself. So it's kind of an invitation to realize that, Father Dan Harrington, I quote this in my book, which I love, which is basically saying that, he says that not believing in the miracles is basically saying because someone can't walk on water today, they could never walk on water. Another scholar, Gerhard Lofing, says that we try to make Jesus the same as everybody else. Well, he couldn't have done that. But Father Lofing says, which I love this expression, he is irritatingly unique.
That's great.
So
Great line.
I think it's. I do tend to go. I would say the more traditional. I think we can't be literal about these things, right? I mean, I think that obviously some in the editing process were embellished, but you cannot get away from the fact that in the Gospels, like something like 1/3 of Mark is miracles. I mean, you take the miracle stories out, and a lot of it just falls apart. The disciples and the Gospel writers are kind of grappling with what they saw. And at the very least, the lowest possible denominator is to say this, that people who were with Jesus believed that he was able to do miracles. We have to grapple with that.
And that they were based in an event. Whatever happened and however it happened, okay, there might be layer upon layer of theological reflection of, I'm probably more strongly of the biblical and theological emphasis than you are, I think, of really locating those Gospels within communities very strongly. I know you're not against this in the book, but I probably, in my theology, and I know several others would be too, like Mark as a suffering community, Matthew as a Jewish community, Luke as a Gentile community, John as a Greek community, and that these were under inspiration, we believe are inspired by the Holy Spirit to reflect on those events. But something happened. The event happened. I want to take you to the most important event, and you spend a good deal of time with this, both the crucifixion and the resurrection. But the resurrection is so important for Christians, and you come back, you make that like 1 Corinthians 5, that one, if there be no resurrection, our faith is in vain, and you make that your own creed at that part of the book. Talk to us about the resurrection and your own grappling with it in the book.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked me about that. I mean, that really is the center of my faith. For other people, it's, you say, the incarnation, or maybe the Beatitudes, or moral teachings. But for me, it comes down to the resurrection. And why is that? Well, because it reminds us that once again, nothing is impossible with God, right? That love is stronger than hatred. That hatred is that life is stronger than death. I just celebrated a funeral mass this morning here in New York City, and that Christ can do anything, that God can do anything, and it also is a pattern in our lives. The kind of death and resurrections that we go through when we kind of die to self and are resurrected in a way spiritually. And I really believe that, without the resurrection, the story is basically about this, great guy who performed a few miracles who died. But the resurrection changes everything. And it also, one of the things I like about the resurrection is that if you kind of go backwards and you say, and I think your point is well taken about the communities, the gospel writers are writing about the leaders of the early church, the apostles, right? They would have had little sort of reason to make up stories that would have made these leaders look bad, basically. But, after the crucifixion, the disciples look terrible. Peter has denied him. One of his best friends has betrayed him, Judas, right? The other disciples are running away, all except for the women, and John. They look terrible. They're hiding behind closed doors. Something happens that makes them want to give their lives to Jesus, and a lot of scholars say, well, they were just kind of remembering what Jesus was like, but to my mind, that doesn't explain the radical transformation, But it is. It's hard to describe why it's so important to me, but I think it's because it's this notion that nothing is ever finished with God, that death and suffering do not have the last word, that always something new can come out of something that seems dead. That's a very important message for us. In the church, we, for a long time, people said, nothing can change in the church, right? But it's also a very important message, for us at the end of our lives, too. Christ shows us, he shows us what God has in store for us. So it's really the heart of my faith. And now the thing is, and you know this, the resurrection stories are about the most mysterious in the Gospels.
Well, there are already three traditions, aren't there? So we've already got in the text themselves where, when Jesus gets out of the tomb, who does he appear to first? Well, between four Gospels, is it Mary Magdalene? Is it Peter? Is it an empty tomb tradition? Or is it the witness tradition? Or is it the apparition tradition? So we've already got three different processes happening there. I love the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. You tell the story, but I'll let you tell the story. But it is wonderful. Several people in the room probably don't know the story or don't know that an Islamic family, and I think in the present context in our world, in your country and ours, it's nice to know this. An Islamic family hold the key, and it's in your book. Tell the story.
Yeah, well, the door is shut, let me get this straight, at 8 p.m. at night, and it is open at 4 a.m. in the morning. And because, let's put it this way, there are many Christian denominations that, in a sense, have authority, if you will, over certain sections of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Literally, this room is for the Eastern Orthodox, this room is for the Greeks, this room is for the Roman Catholics, etc., right? And there's fighting that goes on. At one point with the Franciscan friar that ran the place, I said to him, is it true that there are fist fights that happen? And he said, oh, no, just a little shoving, that's all. So, see how they shove one another. This ancient tradition is that, in a sense, to kind of surmount all of these difficulties, an Islamic family, as you said, who has passed this tradition on from, father to son, has this elaborate unlocking and locking tradition, where they pass the key, a huge 1 foot long metal key, through an opening in the door. It's locked, and then it's locked on the other side, and then a person comes up and shuts the little window opening, and then it's a little ceremony. But I mean, imagine,
And I think it's been the same.
Muslims run it.
It's been the same family, same Islamic family, for about 800 or 900 years. It's been an extraordinarily long time, and they live just across the square.
God.
Thank God, yeah. I wanted to ask you about, the portrait that emerges from this book is so intimate, and that's what's so wonderful about it. It's engaging because it is your pilgrimage. It's not everybody's pilgrimage, it's not everybody's take, and you're really upfront about that, and I like it. But it invites us in, but it also rightly then asks us to meditate on the here and now, and really the question of what would Jesus do, which regularly comes up pastorally, every time, and we all know the story of the old parish priest where the curate, the assistant, turned up and said, well, I didn't know whether to give communion to that guy or not because he's a notorious sinner, but I just said to myself, what would Jesus do? And the pastor said, oh my God, you didn't ask that, did you? Well, that has done the rounds for a while. Well, that really came out in this book too. What would Jesus do? How do you answer that question? How do you grapple with it?
Yeah, it's a tough question. I was asked that question this week at a talk in New York, and I think there are two ways to answer. One is with caution, because when you say what would Jesus do, you have to say which Jesus. The Jesus that turned the tables over in the temple, the Jesus that cursed the fig tree, right? I mean, the angry Jesus. I've often thought that I think I may have mentioned this to you, Richard, I think that we could come up with a whole new series of mysteries in the Rosary called the Furious Mysteries.
That's right.
Jesus curses the fig tree. Jesus says, get behind me, Peter. Jesus turns the tables over. So what? The angry Jesus, the compassionate Jesus, the forgiving Jesus, the Jesus in Mark, Matthew, Luke, John, the Jesus that, talks for pages and pages. And so there are different, as you say, they're written for different communities. It's the same person. It's not as if these stories are made up, but it's 4 different authors writing for 4 different communities. We're going to get different pictures. So in a sense, asking that question, usually, as someone said to me during this talk, usually the person has the answer already in mind. When someone says, well, Father, what would Jesus do? And he already knows the answer. Jesus would do X, right? So you need to treat it with caution. On the other hand, I think it is sometimes a valuable question, because there are clearly some situations that Jesus over and over and over again, consistently in the Gospels, points to. So, for example, great disparities of income, the poor not being taken care of, loving your enemies, forgiving those who persecute you, taking care of the poor. I mean, prayer. So there are things. I sometimes think that when people say, "Oh, well, we can't ask that question at all," there are some things that we can reasonably say Jesus would not be happy with this, or to sort of push it a little further, Jesus is not happy with this because he's alive and he's risen.
I remember vividly our brother and great biblical scholar Joe Fitzmyer was in Australia when I was a scholastic in Melbourne, a seminarian, and Joe Fitzmyer, I'll never forget, said the 2 biggest sins in the New Testament Jesus has next to nothing to say about sex in the Gospels, and he said that doesn't mean it's unimportant, it's just a statement of fact that the Lord doesn't have a lot to say about it. He said the 2 biggest sins in the New Testament are hypocrisy and those who won't forgive. And that's so challenging that the Lord himself on every page comes back to condemn or to judge those who say one thing and do another. And the second is those of us who won't forgive. And both of those, particularly forgiveness, is extremely difficult. So from the Lord's own lips, the thing we've most got to work on is to not be a hypocrite and to be a forgiving person. I still find that challenging. So there are some big themes that emerge that we know what Jesus would do: not be a hypocrite and he'd be forgiving.
No, that's very helpful to hear. I've not heard it encapsulated so well.
I'm going to put it in my next. Yeah, I'm going to put it in my next book, and you're going to put it in the revised version of this book.
I'm going to tweet it out tonight. No, I mean, to make a joke, I would say, and thank God that I'm not a hypocrite like all those other people.
That's right. It's fantastic. You know, I'm going to leave it with this, my last question, and then we're going to open up to the floor. But it's simply this. You know, one of the things that is a bugbear for me with Jesus in the Gospels is we have spent so much time saying Jesus is the fulfillment of the Old Testament, which is true, but he's also a corrective to the Old Testament, and that's also part of our tradition, which we've tended to de-emphasize. So we've tended to say, and I think that's led to a very faulty Trinitarian theology, because you can have nasty God the Father in heaven, lovely Jesus, and the bird, and that's sort of as rich as the Trinity gets for some people.
That's right.
You know, and I know that to be true, and so people have to live in this tension between lovely Jesus and awful God. And so when bad things happen in their life, and where the hell is God and why bother praying, just to plug my own books here while I can. And by the way, I don't know about yours being a Christmas gift. I've written a book for bloody Christmas. Give me a break. So buy both. And but in those books, I try and say, look, Jesus also is the definitive face of God for the world. If we've got to go for a God who can, in certain parts of the Old Testament, be vengeful and nasty and destructive, none of this is in Jesus. And so he doesn't turn anybody into a pillar of salt. He doesn't send a plague. He doesn't maim people. No one goes up with one bad leg and he hates the look of them, so he gives them two bad legs for their trouble. So, you know, I think with the corrective element is important too, and this is not trendy. This is not Jesuit. It's not trendy. To have seen me is to have seen the Father. I do nothing on my own. The Father and I are one. And as you know, you and I know, Dan Harrington was very, very big on this in his own scholarship, that Jesus is also the face of God for the world, the definitive face of God for the world. And I think your book does that really well too.
Well, thanks. Yeah, I think it's difficult because there's always a tendency, even when you say Jesus is the fulfillment of the Old Testament, to alienate our Jewish brothers and sisters, right?
That's right.
They not surprisingly, that's not something that Jewish people would want to hear. And certainly when you move to corrective, you know, of the Old Testament, it's challenging, I think. And so I think sometimes we have watered down the message, I think, out of a desire not to be offensive. But, you know, I mean, I think by the same token, what I always invite Jewish friends to say is that, you know, there are some parts of the Old Testament that are problematic, right? I mean, I think that's even a more culturally conditioned book. I mean, I tend to think the further back you get, you know, the more we're talking about something that is written, you know, for a community to illustrate kind of a larger truth. So yeah, I think that actually the Old Testament fulfilled is a beautiful way of looking at things. But you're right, it is he does correct, and he does sort of shift the emphasis. You're right. The only person you don't want to be in the Gospels is the fig tree.
Yes. Or the pigs.
Or the pigs, right?
Yeah, I know. Look, I'm so pleased I'm a Christian, because firstly I like bacon, but secondly, you know, the pigs get a very hard time. Very hard time. A young atheist came to see me recently and was very angry about all belief and everything, and I was trying to say how lovely and compassionate Jesus was, and he said, "Unless you're a pig." So, and that was I had to concede the fig tree and the pigs. They get a tough time, all right.
One of the great lines, I put it in a footnote because I couldn't resist, the Jesuit New Testament scholar you mentioned, Father Joe Fitzmyer, talks about the various locations for the story of the Gerasene demoniac. And I talk about this in my book. It's actually pretty interesting. You know,
it is.
Where is it? Because Gerasa is not where the Sea of Galilee was, and Gerasa is apparently 37 kilometers from the Sea of Galilee. And Joe Fitzmyer says, that means that those pigs to have rushed 37 miles and drowned themselves in the sea must have been, quote, the most energetic herd of pigs in human history.
Yes. I think when we talk about points of departure and correction, the word I tend to use when I'm, trying to be as generous is a point of departure. That not everything about Jesus is simply in continuity with the revelation in the Old Testament. It's also a point of departure where then we go and find that, and that gets us around that problem with the Trinity, I think, where you can have, vengeful, nasty, angry God in heaven and lovely Jesus, but we've got the one God. Jim, you've been extremely generous. You've been with us for an hour and a half. It's Friday night and you must be exhausted. You've done a funeral this morning and we've been very grateful. The finest tribute I can pay to any disciple of Christ is simply to say this. For me, and I know I'm pretty sure I'm speaking for a very large number of people in this room, the last hour and a half has helped our faith, our hope and our love. And we thank you very much indeed. I invite you to join me.
Thank you to the Diocese of Broken Bay. It's great to be with you. I want to thank you. You saved me from a 3-day trip, and on a plane. And
well, actually, that was going to be my last thing. You'd call this Holy Land of, Jesus a pilgrimage. The next book is Australia a pilgrimage. We would love that. James doesn't particularly like long plane rides, as you might have worked out, and for a lot of our American brothers and sisters and cousins, coming all this way is just too far. But if we can get a big benefactor, we'll put you at the pointy end of the plane, and that'll make it. You'll come on a champagne cloud all the way to Sydney.
That's a great image. Now, before I leave you, I just want to say thanks, and also please keep me in your prayers, if you would mind.
We will indeed. God bless you, James, and thank you very much, and we'll see you soon.